Good morning, everyone. Can everybody hear me at the back there? Yeah, okay, great. So I'm going to stand because it's a bit awkward to be hiding behind my laptop. So thank you, first of all, to ATypI. This is my first time talking at ATypI, and I'm first, so I'm going to be the first pancake and grease up the wheels for you guys. So today I'm going to talk to you about an idea I'm calling Synoptic Translations, which is kind of a wordy way of describing the synthesis between text and image that happens in infographic visual languages or graphic landscapes. So I'm just going to break that into two parts. And this is really just to give the backdrop to a project that I developed for an undergraduate audience in their fourth semester or second year of a visual communications degree. So synoptic meaning basically what we understand of a synopsis, something that affords a general view of the whole, a comprehensiveness or breadth of view, and most importantly for the project that I gave them, narratives or pieces of information that exist simultaneously. And then the other part of this is the translation aspect. So it's really just a way of reframing the students' way of thinking about themselves as graphic designers and thinking about their skill sets as more broadly applicable and as regards integrating visual and verbal. So this is going back to Michael Rock's Designer as Author from 1996, where he talks about three possible options for redefining how we see a designer. And one of those is as a translator. And he defines translation as something that reflects both the character of the original and the spirit of the contemporary, as well as the individuality of the translator. So I was really trying to pull these two concepts together into the development of a project where the students will kind of fast forward through the synthesis of these ideas. They're in their second year, so they're not fully, the penny hasn't dropped yet and all these ideas haven't come together. So in this presentation, I'm just going to go through the pedagogical goals, so I've started that already. Contextualizing the project and the learning goals in light of historical precedents, and lastly, shedding new light on old approaches in the student outcomes. So in order to do that, I've kind of pulled out three themes or three subject areas that I wanted the students to think about as regards authorship, interpretation, and principles from way back in 1665 with micrographia, where we saw the first use, or not the first use, but a very important use of visualizing intangible subject matter in a way that helped us to interpret the world. So looking at representation, these are sort of three streams that I'm trying to tie together in this project so that the students get a sense of what came before and what they could do next. So looking at representation and interpretation, how we take content and then think about presenting it, and how that presentation is in itself an interpretation, that there is no such thing as a neutral piece of information. Then looking at the role of authorship and media, going from the Bauhaus, where we're sort of a conduit for information, through Fiore and McLuhan in the 60s, where the medium is the message, and we're looking at authorship as a viable, graphic authorship as a viable part of a graphic designer's toolkit. And then the basis of all of this, which is the visual grammars or typographic grammars on which everything sits. So the first aspect of this, I'm just going to talk you through some of the examples that I gave the students with a view to explaining the synoptic and the translation aspect of the project. So the synoptic view then is, as according to Francesco Franchi, some of you might be familiar with his work, and he uses the word synoptic in describing some of his work, is where we see infographics as both design and narrative, looking at a union between graphics and journalism. So again, this idea of authorship coming through here, and representation and interpretation in a fused whole. So on the left-hand side here, this is a piece for intelligence and lifestyle, which he creates infographics for. And these are standalone infographics, but the purpose of this project was to look at sequential infographic narratives. And so he calls this a synoptic map, and it's a visual representation of abstract content and plot summaries and the interaction between players in a story arc. And then on the right-hand side, what you can see is an integrated visual landscape of typography, graphic language, and photography. And then Nicholas Felton, another person who does this really well, the visual language aspect, conceiving of a communication as both typography and graphic elements and photography coming together in the representation of content that he generates from his year. So he collects the data himself and then translates that for an audience. So it's really looking at using the graphic designer's skill set or the infographic concepts and pulling them all together into a narrative. And so another thing that I talked to them about was some of the concepts from things like Edward Tufte's envisioning information. So on the right-hand side here, these are sort of a summary of the key points that he makes, looking at the importance of macro and micro readings in creating charts where you can see the broader or synoptic view of the content, and then allow the reader to or audience to drill down into more fine-grained detail where you retain the complexity and eradicate the complicatedness. And the same thing can be seen, and this is the intention here, was to get the students to think about the fact that this is also that these same parallel principles are at work in both graphic grammars and typographic grammars. And so in typographic grammars, we think about the large scale type as something that denotes personality or is expressive in some way, and then the smaller scale elements giving us the detail, and how those two things interact is central to that kind of endeavor. And then he also talks about layering and separation of data. And we have the same thing in typographic structures where we look at concurrent narratives, things like captions alongside the body copy. When he talks about the multiplication of images or small multiples to denote certain amounts or quantities, we also see that in repetition with variation, things like chapter headings, orienting the reader in the document that they're in. And lastly, narratives of space and time. And this is happening in the typographic world too, when we're looking at structural hierarchies, nested content on the web, etc. So all of this then I tried to frame with a view to giving them a sense of how this is important as a more philosophical backdrop to their work. So Nick Susanis' book Unflattening, if anybody has read that, is a really beautiful kind of argument for an integrated typographic language, where he argues that by separating the visual and the verbal, which we traditionally have done, and not thinking of them as an integrated language, we are isolating ourselves in certain modes, which then limit our thinking, which then limits our understanding of the world. And you can see here on the right-hand side how we read the book. The middle part there is the spread. How we go through the content is at both, it's a simultaneous text and image combination, which is something that happens in infographics. But I wanted them to think about how infographics are changing and becoming more prevalent on the web and allowing a kind of sequential narrative to happen. So then the other part of this is to see the role of the graphic designer as a translator. And so I showed them the work of the Isotype collective and talked to them about the idea of the transformer, which is quite similar to the translator. And Marie Neurath describes the responsibility of the transformer as being to understand the data, to get all the necessary information, to decide what is worth transmitting, to make it understandable, and to link it with general knowledge. So again, there's an authorship there, and there's also a translation aspect to it. So you can see that in both of these examples here on the left-hand side, the how long do animals live? Grouping the animals according to color, so their species type is denoted by color, but we also get this kind of playful structure to explain to us how long the life is. So it's not just infographics as a like cold hard facts translated into cold hard graphics, but there's actually a story there and a kind of an authorship. And then on the right hand side, the really important distillation of content and the mapping out of how this information is going to happen in a structure. And then also I talked to them about the sequential work of Quentin Fiore in The Medium is the Message, where he looked at the impact of the medium of television on how we cohere text and image and present information in a more real-time fashion. In a way that would then fuse visual and verbal to become a single totality, according to Stephen Heller. And then I also put this in the context of how graphic structures or translations, information translations, taking content from one mode and putting it into the visual mode, help us to interact with the world. So this is a visual analysis of a piece of music from a color theory class with Vasily Kandinsky in 1930. And here's a more recent example in 2010 of a visualization by Mike Deal of Humpback Whale Song, where we see that this is this kind of parsing of information and translating it into visual form helps us to reimagine the underlying structures and interact with them in a different way than we would usually. And Johanna Drucker, whose book Graphesis, Visual Forms of Knowledge Production heavily influenced the development of this project, describes these kind of languages of form, or what I'm calling synoptic translations, as a systematic approach to graphic expression as a means as well as an object of study. So really trying to hammer home to the students that this is not just a way of presenting information, but a way of thinking. So this brings us to the project itself, which I called Visual Explanations of Natural Processes because synoptic translations didn't really make it clear. And I framed it as the creation of a graphic narrative, but with the focus being on the integration of text and image. And in the context of the changing role of this integration, where we're seeing infographics supporting news content in publications that are moving to the web. And so hopefully this will work. Okay. This is just something that I showed them. This is an infographic explanation of the movie Inception, which typographically and graphically just explains what's happening in that kind of confusing movie. And it's very simple, but you can see that the graphic language is consistent, the typography and the graphics are working together. There are color coding and use of space and interaction to tell us a story. And it's happening over a series and sequence of frames, etc. How do I get out of here? Okay, so that was the backdrop. And then I told them to find and research a natural system or process. So the purpose of researching it themselves is that they want to have this authorship role where they are finding something that they're interested in. They're having to navigate the content like a transformer would. They are having to then distill that content into 3 narratives. And I said 3 because I wanted 2 of those to be the text and the image, and then something else to be the supporting role. And this is not the kind of, and I made this very clear to them, not the kind of hierarchical levels that we talk about when we give a typographic project and we say you must have a heading and a body copy, etc., but different narratives that all work concurrently and simultaneously, and they have to think about how they're going to deliver that content with regard to the medium, and then translate that into a symbiotic typographic language and pace it with regard to the medium, or use their design skills as a visual language to translate. So I'm just going to show you 3. This is Gracie Harm's it's called Hiding in Plain Sight, and it's the process of art forgery identification. And so you can see from the start there, they're using ReadyMag, which I gave them as an option. They didn't have a specific medium that they had to work in because the medium was supposed to be selected based on the content that they wanted to explain. So a couple of them, and these are the ones that were most successful, used ReadyMag because it gave them the opportunity to make interactions and to play with the interactivity of the medium without actually knowing how to code. So she's telling us how to use it from the start. We scroll. She's selected the content and taken a lot of the photographs herself. She's choosing the typeface and the pacing to work as a system. We have a code that we learn how to use. We navigate the content and we have this paced delivery of information, little pop-outs, rollovers. The infographics, she has selected what kind of information is relevant to each of these kinds of content, and each of them pops up differently. Similar repeating behaviors. Then what do we look for? Step 1, we can look at the different things that a art forger identifier is looking for. And then the graphic language as it relates to the typography is well considered. And then using the interactivity to show the behavior of certain processes. And again. And then this one is Corey's exposed inside the insides of cameras. And so here we're looking at the how cameras operate and the history of cameras. And so he's made all these vector graphic illustrations and intending to show the movement of a shutter So we have a little bit of kind of jolty movement there, but using the interactivity then to explain how the camera operates. And we can roll over and get more information. This one should show, yeah, the reaction of exposure to light. So they're really having some fun with how the interactivity works. Showing us a shutter, giving us some more information as we go through there. Thinking about the graphic language continuing and how it relates to the text. And then integrating other kinds of content. And then the last one I will show you, I don't know where I am on time. Okay, this is a print piece. It's called, by Dean Sweetness, called Warped Cycles of Thought. And here the idea of authorships comes through again. He decided he wanted to show the intangible process of negative thinking. And so this is probably one of the very few times I've seen scanning and distortion of type used with an actual reason behind it. And so here he's trying to make a typographic graphic language that shows the distortion of thoughts to make them negative. And this is part of his process was to include the students in his group in the content generation. So he did a thought survey that he used then to make type, that he used then to distort. And he made the infographics using what came out of that scanning and distortion technique so that they would work as a completely fused graphic language. And then he also researched the history of psychology and made this infographic that charts the development of psychology from 600 BC, and decided he wanted it to relate to the style of illustration or the graphic language that was coming from the distortion of the text. So the outcomes then, I hope you will agree, are that this project, in giving the background story to infographic integrated text and image languages, forced the students, or gave them the opportunity to experiment with new media, to include multiple levels of narrative. It forced, again, engagement in authorship and tacit ownership of the content, and a sensitivity to typographic interaction, which continued then in a project that came afterwards, which I was really happy to see. This is Dean's, it doesn't matter what the project brief was, but you can see here that he's integrating text and image and quite complex graphic detailing into the next project that came along. And that's it. Thank you.